I'm Adrian Butler, Principal Investigator of CAMELLIA, and let me start off by giving you a very warm welcome on behalf of the whole CAMELLIA team. CAMELLIA, or to give it its full name, Community Water Management for a Livable London, is a 5-year project funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, which is seeking to develop new ways of enabling different communities to work together to better manage water in London and beyond. There are 4 academic partners: Imperial College London, University College London, the University of Oxford, and the British Geological Survey, along with a broad range of project partners. We're roughly halfway through our work programme and wanted to mark this by organising this meeting, where we're asking a really topical question. Do we have an urban water quality crisis? I'm sure all of us joining this morning are aware that water quality, in particular the problem of untreated sewage entering our rivers and watercourses, has become one of the major news stories of the past few months. The reasons for this situation are complex and challenging, and we'll hear more about them shortly. But they do seem to constitute what scientists and planners often class as a wicked problem. In other words, a problem which cannot be definitively resolved. One of the aims of today's event is to challenge this notion and see what can be done to help find ways to solve our urban water quality problem. To do so, we need changes in legislation, enormous investment, technical innovation, and all importantly, community action. And our invited panel was chosen to reflect all these areas. In a few moments, I will hand over to Jacob Tompkins, a member of CAMELLIA's advisory panel, who will chair this morning's discussion and introduce our panel. Before doing so, I just want to explain briefly the structure of today's event. We'll be running 2 sessions. The first is this webinar, which involves a set of short presentations from our panel, followed by a Q&A discussion period. Then, just before 11 o'clock, we will close this session and we'll have a short break before starting a Zoom meeting, where we'll be showing some of the tools we've developed as part of CAMELLIA, and where you'll have an opportunity to engage in a more interactive way with members of the team. More on that later. I now want to hand over to Jacob Tompkins. Jacob has a wide-ranging portfolio, including being an environmental advisor to the National Farmers Union, a specialist on water resources and water efficiency at Water UK. He also founded Waterwise in 2005. He has sat on or chaired a number of important national and international working groups on water management, including chairing Ofwat's Resilience Committee. He's currently CTO of the Water Retail Company. Jacob, we're delighted to be able to for you to join us today, and in spite of some personal challenges, thank you for chairing this first session, and over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. I am delighted to be involved in CAMELLIA, and this is a very timely and very interesting session. There's some excellent speakers. I think we've also got a highly informed and technical audience, so the discussion and the questions should also be quite interesting. So the question is, do we have an urban water crisis? I think we'll all have slightly different views on this, but it's certain that there is a major issue. This also relates to the climate crisis that we're suffering. There's a very big overlap between water and climate, and one of the advantages, I think, of CAMELLIA is it's a meta project that's bringing together science and applying it at a community scale and developing tools that means that that science can be applied to real on-the-ground solutions, which is what we need if we're going to solve the water and climate crisis. So we have a really interesting and very well qualified range of speakers. I think, first of all, I'd like to introduce David Johnson, who's the Technical Director of the Rivers Trust. I'm sure you all know the Rivers Trust, but basically they have been working on developing local community projects around rivers, but connecting those with NGOs, regulators, water companies, academics, and the wider community to protect and enhance rivers across the UK and now Ireland. David is the technical lead here, and for the past 6 years he's been delivering a national programme of technical engagement, and they have real on-the-ground experience of what it means to manage catchments. So David, I'll put the question to you. Is there an urban water crisis, and what can we do about it?
Thanks very much, Jacob. Well, we'll just wait for the slides to come up. I wanted to give our perspective on the question posed. So if we go on to the first slide, please. I wanted to start with this quote: water quality is now in a better state than any time since the Industrial Revolution, because I found it quite a useful way of thinking about water quality, how much of a problem it is, and what, if anything, has made a difference in the past. Now, if we look at this graph, the arrows disappeared, but the Industrial Revolution started in the 1760s, and we can see that you know, the claim is not that helpful. Frankly, water quality has not is not improved. But what's really been useful for me is to look back through those trends and try and understand a bit, you know, properly what's happened to different water quality indicators over the last decades and longer. So we go on to the next slide. So of course it's a very variable picture. Some urban water quality issues have improved, but still not great. Things like metals, BOD, DO, etc. Some issues have got worse. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, for example. And some water quality issues are stable, but still not great. And nitrate, probably driven by upstream agriculture as well as population. Some issues we're not even measuring at the moment, but we can hazard a guess that they're not great, like microplastics. There's a very variable picture, which you'd expect, but if you just click the next button, but the overall, if we just move forward a bit, yep. But the overall picture is not great in terms of the impact on our ecological health, and very few of those blue rivers are in urban areas. So I think, you know, overall, you know, there's a variable picture as you'd expect, and we do have, you know, an urban but also a rural water quality crisis, and the trends in the past give us some indication of what has shifted the dial in terms of water quality. I'm now going to go on to the next slide and what we can do about it. So I think it's quite, you know, there's two main responses: engineering and community, in my book anyway, community-led adaptive management. So engineering is, you know, is first response, and and it will continue to make a huge difference to water quality. We spent 300 million on the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive compliance, and that shifted the dial. So we can see the sort of, you know, the scale of the investment that's required. But the part I'm more interested in, that I work in, is the second part of that, which is the adaptive management cycle. So the first, if we just go back to the last slide, the first part of that is community engagement and building partnerships. Second stage of adaptive management is using data and evidence to really do the right thing in the right place. Third stage is actually doing it. Fourth stage is measuring to make sure that what you've done has made a difference that you thought, and then the whole process starts again. So I'm going to go through each of those stages and the experience I've gained over the last kind of 10 years working with a catchment-based approach, and you know, and how this kind of approach pans out. So if we go on to the next slide. Well, I love this photo because it's taken from a workshop we did in Liverpool, where we've done some modelling to target natural flood management within the urban environment, and we gather around a map and try and really get everybody together to understand how the system works. And this sort of approach works really well with, you've got professional partners. It's not necessarily so good with wider stakeholders. So if we just click on again and again. So one approach that we're trying now in a project is called causal loop modelling, where you get the stakeholders, you interview the stakeholders, and you try and get a representation of the conceptual model that's inside their head. Now, I don't know whether this is going to continue to help build partnerships, but I have a sense that it really will, because it's really forcing us to listen a lot more intently each of the stakeholder groups, represent their understanding of the system, and then share their understanding with other members of the stakeholders. So that's, you know, that's another method that we're trying to build partnerships. If we go on to the next slide. This one's to do with, it's also to do with engagement, which is a lesson that I've really learned over the last few years, which is the publication of the data on the surge map. When we first published this a couple of years ago, hugely uncomfortable for me because the data underpinning it was really quite poor, and I'm really uncomfortable publishing data when you know that the quality of it is not great. And yet good things have happened from publishing this data, and I think it's really taught me a few lessons. So when we published it, a few things happened. People got angry, basically. Communities got angry because they didn't realise what was going on. The regulators and the water companies got angry because they knew the data was actually quite poor, and you know, it was not that easy to interpret. And we got angry because we spent a lot of time trying to massage the data and get it into a shape that we could publish it. But what's been great is what's really worked about this is we've not overclaimed what this data represents. We've just published the data as it is, and we've kept the message really simple. And we've avoided trying to sensationalize it. I think we just put it out as it is. I mean, there's been lots of maps that have been produced by us which I haven't let out the door because they're simply unrepresentative. They give a misleading picture. And I think we've also, if you just click the next button, we also included on the map the ability for communities to say, actually, we don't agree with the data. You know, we've spotted a problem with it. And again, it's that whole cycle of allowing people to see the data and question. So I think, you know, that's been a very engaging process, and and has taught me some lessons about the fact that we have to get the data out there, whatever the quality. Okay, next slide, please. So the second stage of adaptive management is democratizing data, making it available so that people can really see it. So we do this in catchment-based approach by creating, if you just click on one, data explorers. And the whole idea of this is to try and make it so that anyone, even people who don't have GIS, can access the data, really get into it and understand what's going on. And if you click it again, we even publish data like health and well-being data, again, so that communities can really understand, you know, where the issues are in their catchments and target their work. There's nothing magic about this. It's really just allowing everybody the same access to the data that GIS folk have had for a decade or so, or more than decades. Right, if we click onto the next slide. But providing data is not good enough on its own. You've got to provide the support to go with it to help people, and that's what we do in CABA. We sort of provide training and stuff and publish it online. And if you just click on one more, we're re-releasing the cover data package in totally online form in a month's time. So again, same 200 data layers in there, but you've got a user guide to go with them to say what you can and can't use each of the data sets for. So if we just click on again. But one thing we've really learned this year again in terms of providing data, and this came from the data forum that we held earlier this year, is how you publish it. You know, just giving people data doesn't necessarily engage with them. This is a really great example that we had at the forum this year. Each of the squares represents billions of dollars spent on particular budgets. I've circled the UK defence budget, the amount of money it would take to adapt to climate change for developing countries, and the cost of obesity. And then if we go on to the next slide, the yellow square is the size of the budget that we spent on the banking industry after the financial crash. So again, it's this whole, you know, just putting data out there. We've learned that we really have to think about how we put it out there in a way that enables people to engage and understand the data. And that's Surge Map has been, you know, probably our best example of that this year. So we'll go on to the next slide. The third stage is obviously to try and is to deliver. make a difference, put green and blue infrastructure into our catchments, our urban catchments, rural catchments, so that we make a difference. So we've engaged, we found out how people understand the catchment. Step one, we've used the data to target where to put the right thing in the right place, and now we're putting the right thing in the right place. And each one of those dots on the map, one of those blue dots, is 4,335 of them. A community has built something to change, in this case, flood risk in their catchment. And I think, you know, this is a great sort of power of GIS online, is that you can allow communities to deliver and tell us what they've delivered and show that they've delivered the right thing in the right place and what the sort of benefits are. You can see the storage that's being created there on the right hand side, 1,609,000 meters cubed. And it clicks up each time someone delivers something. So I think it's it's really important, if we're going to use this adaptive management approach, to know what we've delivered and where it is. If we click on the next slide, and so the next generation of this tool will look at all the nature-based solutions, so wetlands, suds, all that type of thing, just because it's so important to know where stuff is, and then what benefit it's providing, and then how we look after it into the future so it continues to provide those benefits in our urban and rural situations. So if we go on to the next slide. The catchment-based approach, you know, as part of this delivery, and if we just click on one, we've got partnerships all over the country, 100+ partnerships, been going for about a decade now, and there's an evaluation model underpinning the whole process, which is run every year to try and identify the wider benefits of this kind of adaptive management approach. And if we click on again, the model was designed by the Open University, by social scientists there, and it's a really great foundation for making sure that we we know what benefits we're delivering. Final stage, stage 4 of adaptive management, is monitor. So you've got to monitor what you've done to make sure it did what you expected, and then if it didn't, you adapt what you're doing. And one of the most exciting developments that we've had this year has been the funding of the Catchment Monitoring Cooperative, which has just been announced. This is where CABA will work with 10 water companies under the Offer Innovation Funding to create a national citizen science framework. And citizen science has been going on, and great citizen science, for a while, but this is about really upscaling it and making it a really important part of the evidence base. And what we say is that what we want is every community to know more than government about how its catchment is working. So if you click onto the next slide, lots of great initiatives already going on out there, as I said, and delivering evidence. And I think if we click onto the next slide, but one of the reasons why we wanted this catchment monitoring cooperative is so that we're aware of the issues that affect all. If we could just go back. All monitoring. So this slide shows the WIMS, the Environment Agency spot sampling data. That's the blue and red dots. It also shows the continuous monitoring of the water quality parameter, and it shows that spot sampling isn't capturing the picture at all. So, if we're going to design this monitoring cooperative to really help us understand what's going on, we have to have a hypothesis. In this case, it might be that the water quality dips at night time. And then if we're going to sample, we're going to sample at night time, not at 10 o'clock in the morning when we're not going to see these issues. So it's that's what the catchment monitoring cooperative is all about, is that kind of supporting that management approach. And if we go on to the last slide, second to last slide, and then the process all starts again, and you go back, engage with the communities you've now delivered, you've monitored, you know what's working, what isn't working. And then in this particular case, you just click on, we're kind of engaging with community flood action groups and trying to make them part of the community of doers. So I think I'll probably leave it there, and hopefully I'm more or less on time.
Thank you, David. That was extremely interesting, particularly the democratization of data, and also the application of science with the general public. That's what it's about. How can we take all of this science that we're doing and let the public use it? And the clever ways that you're presenting and packaging that data, and also understanding the way people in local communities think about data, is really, really interesting. And this fits at the heart of what CAMELLIA is doing. I think also there is a salient lesson for water companies. I was involved in a WWF report in 2017 called Flushed Away, where we were trying to look at discharges. We had freedom of information requests that we put to water companies, and we didn't get any data, and we got vilified. And I remember in the report that I did for Ofwat on resilience, one of the first things we said is all of the data should be in the public domain. This would help a lot. It would also mean that the public could understand how difficult it is for water companies. But by hiding the data and denying the problem, it doesn't benefit anyone. So the stuff you're doing is fantastic. In terms of questions for everyone, if you can post questions in the Q&A and then upvote them, we'll ask them at the end. But there is one very quick clarification, if that's okay, David. Someone said, what is the parameter for the long-term concentration graph? The one
that was nitrate.
And where's the data from?
There's a paper, so I can put I will find the reference and put it in the chat.
Brilliant.
As soon as I found it, I'll do it after when the next presenters present.
Thank you so much, David. And now we're moving on to Right Honourable Philip Dunne MP. I'm sure that most of you know Philip. He's the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, and it is well worth looking at their investigation into water, which you can find in Hansard or online, or you can read the transcripts. Philip has been campaigning on water quality for a long time now, both through the committee but also as a local MP, and he is a very good friend of water, linking both the political and the science part. So we're delighted to hear from him. So Philip, is there an urban water crisis, and what can be done about it?
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you for that introduction. And I'd just like to start actually by thanking David for his presentation and the fantastic work that the Rivers Trust has been doing, has just demonstrated very, very ably, and to provide really the first national data available to the public and to campaigners in a comprehensible and interrogatable form, to tell public and the regulators and everyone what's really going on, which most people have not been aware of. So I'm going to answer your question very straightforward, Jacob, by saying yes, there is a crisis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we are doing in Parliament to try to fix it. And it's a very, very timely opportunity for this discussion, because the Environment Act came into force this month after 2 years of germination. It's the largest piece of environmental legislation that we've had in this country for 40 years, because during our membership of the European Union, the rules were largely made by the EU, and we've had to create our own legislation. One of the questions in the chat was about whether the EU Water Directive still has force, and of course what we've actually done is we've transposed existing EU legislation into UK legislation, and the Environment Act then takes it on a stage further, and in particular in relation to water quality, has some very specific, which I'm going to spend most of my remarks talking about, because it's the what do we do about it part of the question that I want to address. But before I do, I'd also like to pick up, Jacob, your comment about working on the Flushed Away report of the WWF. That really was the first time that the public got a proper understanding of what has been going on hitherto unobserved, because sewage and dredge operations are generally under the ground or behind barbed wire fences in treatment works, which are inaccessible to the public, and only people who are using our waterways, our rivers, and do so near an outfall, had a proper understanding there was stuff going into our rivers routinely that shouldn't be. And that report was seminal in getting many campaign groups up and running and providing the first insight of transparency in what has been happening. And it was that really got me interested in this subject. And in beginning of last year, I had the opportunity in two ways to start doing something like this. First of all was by becoming chairman of the Environmental Audit Committee. I was able to help the committee decide to look into the whole issue of water quality. And as you've mentioned, Jake, we have a report. It's actually, we've been doing an inquiry. The report won't be out until probably just into the new year, but we're just finalising the work that we've been doing. I would expect that report will get some attention when it comes out. But perhaps more directly relevant, I won the equivalent of the political lottery by getting a 7th slot on the ballot for private members' bills, and the Sewage Inland Waters Bill was introduced to the House in February 2020. And as a result of the COVID pandemic and the impact that had on parliamentary timetable, it never emerged from the first read to the second reading, and therefore it not debated in Parliament. And when it became apparent to me that I wasn't going to get my moment in the sun to start talking about this, I began to engage more seriously with the Environment Minister and government officials. And Rebecca Power, the Minister, was really interested in this whole issue and persuaded her officials to devote some time when they were able to get to the Environment Bill, having had a very busy legislative programme in the sort of around the whole Brexit issue, therefore had more legislation than any other department. We began to engage about how we could improve the Environment Bill, as it then was, to take account of some of the measures in my private members' bill. And we had a lot of support from NGOs, including the Rivers Trust, and from academics, including Professor Adrian Butler here at Imperial and colleagues from UCL in constructing the private members bill and then in helping to improve the Environment Bill behind the scenes. And so I'd just like to touch on what the Environment Act, as it now is going to do, which will start to address some of the challenges of, in particular, water quality and water companies, the role that they play in treating effluent and sewage, but also will have an impact on other polluters over time, and in particular agriculture. So the bill originally had a significant section within it, introducing for the first time the requirement on water companies to publish drainage and sewage management plans. And the requirement is that these plans should be produced every 5 years, and they should last for 25 years. So they provide a plan which will be available to the public of what water companies are going to do to start to address the challenges of underinvestment for decades in the infrastructure which deals with human waste, which has not kept pace with the pressures of development and population growth, I would say, over the last 60 years. So this is in legislation. It was always planned by the government that the companies have to produce these plans. And crucially, the plans will have to be approved by the department, by the Secretary of State has a power if the government department responsible don't think the plans are doing enough to be able to send that to make them better. So that's providing a direct lever for the Secretary of State on water companies to ensure that they're planning to do enough to tackle this issue in each successive plan. So that's a really groundbreaking focus on water treatment, which has not happened before through legislation. And I'll come on to sort of how that's going to be acted upon in a few moments. The other thing that already in the bill was picking up the point that David was making about transparency of data. At the moment, the evaporation monitors, the EDMs, measure the frequency and duration of spillages from treatment plants. They do not measure the volume of material that is discharged, whether partially treated or untreated. And the bill requires water companies start calculating the volume of material sent into our waterways. And that will, again, go a long way towards helping to address the challenge who are trying to understand the impact of sewage on water quality. Of course, you know, if spillages are of small volume into a large watercourse, it can be diffused pretty quickly. If, however, it's a large volume in particular going into a small watercourse, it can very much more significant harm. So I think this is going to be a very useful additional tool to allow water companies to understand the problems they're causing, to allow regulators to intervene if incidents are bad. So that was already in the bill, and will become, I'll come on to how it's going to be effective in a moment, but will start to change behaviour. And the other thing that was in the bill is that there would be a requirement for government to identify a standard by which it will be measuring water quality. So they've consulting on these standards in, I think, August 2020 for about a year. We're yet to see the government response to the tests which are covering sort of various things, so air quality, water quality, soil, and other things. But they've made it clear that they wish to have at least one, so that means probably 2 or more tests which water companies will be required to undertake in order to assess the impact of water quality from their activities. Now, during the passage of the bill to the House of Lords, the government introduced 3 separate sets of amendments to the bill, which were directly resulting from my private member's bill, which haven't gone anywhere, and very in broad handfuls. The first set were requirements on the Secretary of State to report to Parliament on various aspects of water quality. And what that does is to impose an obligation on the department to prepare regularly information which the Secretary of State then presents to Parliament, which puts a focus on this issue much, much higher up the agenda within DEFRA, that the Secretary of State of the day will be obliged to make a statement to Parliament of some kind, probably be a written statement, but that's providing a focus which has not existed before. The second set of amendments covered the requirement on water companies to improve their monitoring and improve the transparency of the data that they retain. So this will involve requiring upstream and downstream of outfalls from water company assets, monitoring equipment which is going to require close to real-time disclosure. And by doing it both upstream and downstream, once the parameters have been set, and we don't know what those are yet, there will be a transformation in the ability of people like David to be able to interpret that data and get it out there to the public in close to real time, which will transform one's understanding of the impact of treatment works and storm overflows on our receiving body waters. And that will help both environmental improvement, but also helping public health. And that's included in the third set of amendments, which was putting a duty on water companies progressively to reduce sewage discharges and the impact that that has on both the environment and public health. So that means that there will be both chemical and biological parameters within these monitoring devices in order to make sure that that is understood. Now, we don't know at this point precisely when these changes will need to take effect. That will be set out in regulations which follow the enactment of a new law, and those will start to be published in the new year at some point. And I don't know, and we'll be taking a strong interest in those regulations as to both the effectiveness of the regulations and the timetable with which they will be introduced. But it has taken, I think I'm right in saying, close 10 years from the point at which the decision was made to introduce EDMs into the water system to full implementation. And that's far too long. I don't think the public, and certainly the politicians, will not tolerate that kind of sluggish pace of understanding what is going on. Implementing this law will need to be done more quickly. So the next thing that is being done will be by the government, will be producing the regulations to enact all these laws. And in parallel, the government is due to publish in January its final strategic policy statement for Ofwat for the next 5-year pricing review. And that's a document that's been consulted on. I'm sure many people on this call will have seen it or maybe even commented on it. But the focus of that is, again, going to be to increase materially the focus of water company capital investment through the WINEP on the treatment side of their business. And I'm very clear that our committee has provided some advice to the Secretary of State to beef up the draft statement. And I'm pretty clear that it will be a very different kind of statement than we've had in the past. So this essentially is the document through which the government gives guidance on what priorities it would like to see water companies to be investing in through their capital programs for the subsequent 5-year period. And it happens every 5 years. In the past, as privatisation, the SPS has been focused heavily on dealing with the supply side of water and drinking water, and dealing with leaks and so on, and also ensuring that bills are kept at or around inflation. So those have been the 2 priorities. What we are now calling for, and I think will happen in the next iteration, is that water treatment should be also put up there as a significant priority. And we will see water companies enabled by Ofwat to invest to help meet the obligations that they've got under the Act. So I think we will start to see plans being produced by water companies for significant additional spend on infrastructure, which will be addressing, in many cases, the urban areas ahead of the rural areas, because that's where the bulk of the population and the problem lies. And the balance of that we will have to see over the coming months and years. But I think we're at a point where there has never been as much focus in trying to deal with this crisis. The rivers that we enjoy are the arteries of nature, as I keep saying. The government's priorities for improving biodiversity are writ large now through increasing parts of legislation. So this is playing into much wider contribution towards net zero Britain and climate change, as Jacob was touching on. And I think we will see the water companies playing a very much more significant part in contributing to achieving net zero Britain. And just one small example is the sludge residues that water companies are left with, historically have been spread on farmland, and that's going to become increasingly challenging as we have, as the climate alters and there is greater risk of leachate pushing into the waterways from the land. And I think we're going to have to see some much more imaginative use of that sludge in different ways, and new technologies are now becoming available to be able to manage that. And I think that's a whole other area that we need to get into today. But there is a lot of innovation going on in the water sector at the moment. I've been, touching the surface of it in terms of my understanding, and I think there's a real opportunity for the water industry to transform itself with the help of some very clever people, many of whom will be on this call. Thank you very much, Jacob.
Thank you, Philip. I mean, I think there are two things to say. First of all, it's great that this issue has a friend in Parliament, and the actions that you are taking, influencing policy, are extremely welcome and will have a direct benefit to the aquatic environment. So thank you. I think just to sum up, we're talking about the Environment Act and the work you're doing, increasing the availability of data, increasing transparency, enabling increased engagement with the public, setting tougher parameters and regulations, and delivering action. And I quite often vilify the water companies, but in their defence, I would say that the regulators have not had their eye on the ball on this either. And the fact that now they're going to have direction to do this is better. Water companies effectively do what they're told by the regulator. I run a water company. We get minutiae of questions asked about how our business runs, but they always seem to miss the big picture. And if we can start to actually focus on this, which is something the public wants, then I think we will see massive improvements. And as you say, the water companies are integral to both this and net zero and enhancing the aquatic environment. And if they share the data and the public understand how difficult what they're doing is, we can have a collaborative sort of co-design approach to this. We could have a much very different future. And as far as I can see, if we can go beyond the Water Framework Directive with the Environment Act, that's fantastic. But governments and regulators and water companies need their feet held to the fire. And I'm glad that you and other people in Parliament are doing that. So thank you very much for your work and your contribution. Next, we have Helena Soteriou from Thames Water. She's catchment program manager working on the Smarter Water Catchments program in Thames, which is a flagship catchment. She has links and has been working with 400 different NGOs within Thames Water's area, including in the Crane catchment, one of the first times that a water company is focused on quality in an urban water catchment. So, you know, despite what some of us say, the water companies are doing a lot of work in this area, and to actually engage with 400 NGOs and community groups, it is an amazing piece of work. So, Helena, interested in your view on, is there an urban water crisis, and what can we do about it?
Thanks very much, Jacob. So got a couple of slides. Thanks, Greta. So yeah, essentially I'm just going to talk you through a water company's perspective today. I can't speak for everybody and all the water companies, but I'll touch on some of the work that Thames Water have been doing to date. So next slide, please, Greta. So there'll be three things that I'm going to cover today. The first is just around setting the scene, giving you a bit of background to the WFD, the Water Framework Directive, and where we are currently. I'll then talk a little bit about investment over the years to kind of articulate how we've observed some improvements. But then I'm going to finish with why I think that there still is a crisis and what we can do to address it. So next slide, please, Greta. Yeah, so first off, setting the scene. Thank you. So in terms of what the evidence is saying, essentially the Water Framework Directive back in 2000 was introduced, I guess, for the first time in the UK, a real comprehensive river basin management planning system to help protect the ecological health of rivers, lakes, coastal and groundwaters as well. And this was really underpinned by a set of environmental standards to help us assess the risk to the ecological quality. And in order to kind of set out the improvements that were required to bring these waters back into good condition. So the standards were, I guess, set to kind of provide a general sense of protection for looking at kind of unique and valuable habitats, as well as drinking water resources and the protection of bathing waters, particularly coastal waters. As a 6-year kind of planning cycle, this sort of set out, those almost the requirements for water companies, and then from there we kind of look at the investment required. So in terms of kind of recognising, and the kind of failures to meet some of these standards, you can sort of see over time, graph, that we're still at, in 2020, 36% of these surface water bodies across the whole of the UK, not, I guess, only being high or good status. That's a large proportion that don't meet that. You can see that over time, it's kind of stayed the same in terms of the overall status. And when we really drill down into looking at the reasons why these water bodies aren't achieving good status. So I've just looked at this for the London operational catchment area. You can see that the proportions, kind of come down to three things really. So 35% of, is due to the physical modifications of these rivers, so a lot of straightening that has historically gone on. 25% of that is linked to pollution from wastewater, and 34% is linked to pollution from kind of the urban side, towns, cities, and transport and things like that. So you're just sort of starting to paint a bit of a picture around kind of the sort of current state of play that we're kind of seeing through the WFD parameters as they currently stand. So on to the next slide, please, Greta. So I'm just going to look now at some of the investments that we've observed, that we've implemented over the last 20 or so years, and some of those improvements. So across the UK water industry, we've invested over £1 billion every year on environmental improvements. So I think in terms of context setting, where we started, it's important to kind of remember, or just have in mind how much investment has already happened, and that has been looking at various different things. So examples here like the big Deepham's upgrade to improve the final effluent of discharges to the River Lee. We've got the Reading sewage treatment works, was built back in 2005-06 era. Go on to the next slide, Greta. I've just got some examples here. Yeah, again, the river, the Lee Tunnel, which was built going from Abbey Mills pumping station, the left-hand side there, taking large volumes of sewage to Beckton sewage treatment works. I think it's about 6.9 kilometres going across London there. The Thames kind of skimmer boats, looking at kind of for the first time, I think it was the first of its kind back in 2007, looking at kind of skimming rubbish off and litter from the Thames, and kind of approaching us from lots of different angles. Again, next slide, Greta. Thank you. And probably the most pertinent at the moment is the massive kind of £5 billion investment into the Thames Tideway Tunnel. So really kind of this 25-kilometre super sewer, for those of you that might have seen the programme, really designed to intercept, store and transfer sewage waste away from the River Thames, the main body itself. So, but this investment hasn't just been about assets. Next slide, Greta. We've got a lot of looking at I guess the bigger picture and the interaction with the communities, and I think we've also prioritised kind of our spend on ensuring that we can enhance biodiversity and public amenity. So a good example of this is Walthamstow wetlands, where some of you might have been out in East London. Really one of Europe's largest urban wetlands, open to the public, about 211 hectares big, and really kind of providing a different lens on what a water company should be responsible for. On to the next slide, Greta, thank you. I just want to touch briefly on the benefits, or the observed benefits, of investment over these last 20 years. So I think in terms of kind of rising to a challenge, it's fair to say that we've certainly come a long way as a water industry. So we're really kind of seeing marked improvements in those specific parameters that we have been asked to focus on, and really seeing pollutant loads decreasing by 70%, and kind of really looking at as well some of the serious pollutions coming down. I think as well, just taken from the ZSL State of the Thames report that was recently published a few weeks ago, as an example for the London rivers, you can really see that kind of orthophosphate load coming right down over the last 20, 30 years. So in terms of rising to the challenge, I think it's fair to say we have done a lot of work over the last 20, 30 years, since 1989 privatisation. So come on to the next slide, Greta. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk now about why I think that there is still a crisis despite all of this investment to date, and really kind of trying to articulate some of the key focus points that I think we need to all club together and work on cross sector. Next slide, Greta. Thank you. So in terms of this crisis, water quality crisis, I think it's grown bigger and more complex kind of over the years as research has improved and awareness has increased. So there are a lot of emerging issues that either weren't a problem before, or we didn't have the data and information. You know, we've spoken about kind of David's work with the Rivers Trust, kind of looking at a lot of this data coming through in the last 10 years. But really, when we started to build that WFD, you know, a lot of that data wasn't really there to indicate that there was a problem. A good example of this is the plastic pollution, so the microplastics, and that kind of growing concern as well. And I think a real sort of benefit of all the citizen science work that has gone on is really shining a light on where we might need to prioritise next. I think also the kind of the focus on harmful chemicals in the environment, which weren't previously designated as priority substances in the Water Framework Directive. I think there's limited data on that at the moment, but we really need to focus now on how we can address that. So whether it's at end of pipe or whether it's kind of further upstream in the system. And a really good example of power of legislation is tributylin, where, you know, following its really high levels of damage to the aquatic environment, following its ban, you know, you can really see that levels in the Thames have dropped off dramatically. That's a real kind of example of the power that we have to kind of make change. And I think also the public perception is changing. So when we talk about the extent of the challenge, things that perhaps were acceptable at one stage, you know, a classic example of this is the storm discharges problem that we've got across the water industry at the moment. You know, a starting point of the system that was designed to spill to prevent kind of flows from backing up and flooding into people's homes. You know, we absolutely think that, you know, even if that is the design and the kind of legality of it, you know, that is absolutely unacceptable, and we need to work on how we work, you know, collaboratively address that. So I think emerging issues and kind of public perception is really sort of starting to kind of bring to light the scale of this challenge, and it's quite a large one. So next slide, please, Greta. Thank you. A vision for 2050, I think if we're kind of really serious about being an environmental leader and stewarding the improvements of rivers, the main thing for me and from our perspective is that we really need to think differently, because doing more of the same, as you can see, is not going to get us there. We need to really shake up the model and kind of club together to, as I say, work collaboratively to address some of these these really large scale challenges. So a lot of this work has kind of been driven by Water UK, kind of bringing together that kind of picture of water companies as a whole, and identified 6 kind of strategic responses that we think are kind of required to accelerate the delivery, in order to kind of become these stewards of rivers in the future. And I think we've touched on a lot of it today, talking about kind of collaboration, building partnerships. I think data is a massive point, and being able to have open access data, but also understanding the kind of problems and doing real deep dives into some of these issues, and kind of using an evidence-based approach to build some of our plans. I think that needs to cut across lots of different parameters, because it's not purely just about water quality. It's looking at the bigger picture of water quantity, the ecology and habitats as well, because they play a large part on the health of rivers. So I think it's that kind of holistic view of this work. So innovation will be at the heart of this, and really kind of trialing new approaches, and that's where kind of Jacob alluded to earlier around something that Thames are doing, is leading on more holistic catchment management. And particularly, if you want to find out more information about that, our Smarter Water Catchments initiative, really looking at kind of co-creation and co-design and delivery of schemes in partnership, which is not just the water companies involved, it's also the local authorities, the environmental NGOs, all of those key groups that have a really big part to play, either through being directly involved or passionate about rivers, coming together and co-creating 10-year plans, and we're kind of focusing in on the urban environment as part of that in River Crane, and creating a whole suite of activities for what we can do. So that's something we're kind of practically doing in this kind of asset management period. On to the next slide, Greta. I think the next 5 years are going to be really interesting. So PR24 is the next price review in 2024 that will set out the spend from 2025 to 2030. So that is really the next opportunity to influence how we do things differently. And in this context, I think it's really important to kind of just remind ourselves that we're always guided by our customers, how much they can afford to pay, and that needs to be considered in the round of what household expenditure is, and that's a really difficult balance to strike. Striking the level of ambition, big ideas, big thinking, with the realistic costs of being able to achieve that, because costs ultimately dictate the pace at which we can go and at which we can make progress. So there'll inevitably be some tensions between what we should be investing in, whether that's kind of ensuring better water quality or kind of looking at more of the sort of water quantity aspect, new water resources, potentially kind of looking at different ways of supplying water as well. But that will really be underpinned by a lot of the customer research that we do ahead of each business planning period. So all water companies really kind of dive into what customers would be willing to pay, and that sort of forms the basis of our plan. So I think, just to end with, that I do think there is a water quality crisis. I do think the water industry, working with others, can address it, and because we've risen to challenges before. I think it's going to be very hard, and very interested in hearing any views and opportunities out there to make this happen. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. That was an extremely positive and welcome presentation. I think there are several things that come out of that. If water companies are serious about wanting to engage with others in catchments, then they're pushing in an open door. Academics, NGOs, local communities would love to work more with water companies. I think it will also give them an understanding of how difficult it is for water companies, and that goes hand in hand with the data. And I think you're also right, as we see more data, the situation might look worse, and that's not a bad thing. I think an admission by the water companies that actually, yes, there's all these emerging contaminants, it's a lot worse than we thought, we need your help, let's all work together. And it's also interesting that it is not only the water companies. Water quality is a wider issue for councils, developers, farming as well. Water companies play a very, very large part, but if they can engage with those other sectors too, it's great. And if there can be an innovative and collaborative approach, that's fantastic. I'm not sure whether your view permeates throughout everyone in all water companies at the moment, but if that can change, then I see very, very positive things. So thank you. That was a great presentation. And if we can solve this through collaboration and open data, that would be fantastic. And in terms of questions, there are some quite interesting questions coming through and some quite good themes. If you can post more questions in the Q&A and upvote the questions you want to see answered, I think we can have quite a good discussion. Thank you very much, Helena. And next, we are privileged to have Professor David Balmforth. I can't go through all of his CV because it would take us probably the rest of the presentation, but suffice to say he is an internationally recognised expert in both flooding and urban water pollution. He was previously chair of the Institution of Civil Engineers. He currently sits on the National Infrastructure Commission, plus a whole load of other things. As I say, he has outstanding expertise in this area, and extremely interested to hear your view, David, on is there an urban water crisis? And if so, what can we do about it?
Okay, well, thank you. I'm just set this up and we'll get going. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. I'd like to talk this morning on why a multi-stakeholder approach is needed. And it'll build on some of the comments that have been made earlier, but hopefully there'll be some new points in here as well. I just wanted to start by reminding ourselves what the objectives of a sewerage system actually are. There are three key objectives. The first one is to drain developed areas, urban areas, and prevent those areas from flooding. Secondly, to deal with the foul waste, to convey wastewater to a suitable point for treatment and disposal. And then, of course, and perhaps the most challenging one is, whilst doing both of those, to safeguard receiving waters from pollution. And that's the key topic of today. But I want to mention the other two because these three things are inextricably linked. We, of course, are continuing to develop our urban areas. We only have to look at the maps. If you look at the maps of our urban areas every 5 years, you can see how they're continuing to extend. And this results in some dramatic changes to the natural drainage process. We canalise and culvert our rivers. We pave over our natural areas, and this not only increases the rate and volume of runoff, but it also contributes a substantial amount of pollution from the surfaces itself. We get flooding of our urban areas, as you can see, one of the consequences of this. And we get sorry, let me just go back. And we get pollution of our rivers. The traditional solution for dealing with these problems are that we build new sewers. We build ever larger sewers. This is very expensive. It can result in some cases in moving the problem from one area to another, and it causes considerable disruption to urban areas, to transport, to the economy, and also to people's quiet lives. So it's not always welcomed by the communities that we serve. I was involved in the 1990s and early 2000s in a big improvement programme to our combined sewer overflows in the north of England, where we installed screens to many of these overflows to retain some of the pollutants within the sewerage system, and particularly sanitary products and fecal material to prevent those being discharged into the environment. And these were very successful at doing that. And we also, in a number of areas, if we look at the bottom left picture here, we built a number of large storage tanks at the more polluting overflows to contain what otherwise would have been spilt into the environment and to improve the receiving water quality. And these were also enormously effective. And finally, we, of course, improved a number of larger treatment works and some of the smaller ones as well, just to deal with the point of the growing populations that was alluded to earlier. And this did significantly improve the quality of rivers across the north of England at the time. So I can speak from experience and tell you that with this investment, we certainly can, with engineering solutions, deal with the problem. But of course, we're now facing new challenges. We're facing population growth in our urban areas, as I mentioned earlier, and we're also facing the challenges of climate change. And the combined effects of these are likely to increase the flows in our sewers. So what this pie chart here shows, it shows typical existing rates of flows in sewers, and then the additions that come from these new areas. Climate change, the biggest change there in purple, new development, growth as we call it in the red colour, and then urban creep, which is a term which is used for development which infills space within existing urban areas. And overall, by 2080, from some work we did a few years ago for the government, 40% increase in flows. I think now looking at that figure, that's probably at the minimal end of the change rather than the maximum end of the change. So that is really a very significant increase. And what's dramatic about this is when you actually look at the impact of this, and we tested this over 100,000 properties, it leads to some very significant increases. That 40% increase in flow can lead to a 100% increase in flooded volumes, 130% increase in the numbers of properties that are affected, and a 200% increase in flood damage. So this is not a small impact. And of course, it also has effect on the frequency and volumes of spills from combined sewer overflows, from wastewater treatment work, storm tanks, and is a challenge in terms of meeting the required quality from treatment works overall. So this is not a small problem. And if we look at those traditional solutions which I described earlier, what becomes apparent is that if we continue just to address this with engineering solutions on the main drainage system, the costs become prohibitive, something between a 4- and 8-fold increase in costs simply to stand still. And that's probably not going to be achievable from a financial point of view. The water companies are already spending £3.1 billion of investment on improving storm overflows in the period from 2020 to 2025. And remember that this investment is directly reflected in customer bills. So how would we look at this differently? Could we have a more integrated approach to tackling this difficult problem? Well, one way of looking at this is to think about our drainage systems in a rather different way, to think of them not just as a series of pipes and channels, but the whole process through source, pathway, and receptor. The source being the areas from where the flow comes, rainfall, the foul drainage which comes out of domestic and commercial businesses, the pathways, the channels, not just underground pipes and our rivers, but surface flows as well. And the receptors where we have the impact, whether this is flooded properties or the pollution impact on our receiving waters. And we realise, of course, that we can then start to tackle the problem in these 3 different elements. We can limit flows entering our drainage systems. We can maximise the capacity of the existing drainage system itself, as I've just described. We can actively manage the flows that occur above ground in extreme events. And we can improve the resilience, not just of the fabric of our urban society, but also the resilience of our rivers as well, by making them healthier and naturalising them so they can use their natural assimilative process to deal better with any pollution that they receive. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you some examples of how we might do this, but at the same time, illustrate some of the challenges we face. I think it was in the first presentation we had today, David mentioned the Enfield wetlands projects, and upstream wetlands are known to provide a very good means of controlling the inflows into our drainage systems, whether these be natural systems or our artificial drainage systems, such as our pipes and sewers. And also, of course, this can provide multiple benefits as well for recreation, for wildlife, and even for water resources. But of course, to be effective, this requires a substantial amount of land. So this depends on the availability of that land, the attitude of private landowners, and particularly the strategic position of local authorities and their planning processes. We can limit flows in our urban areas using sustainable urban drainage, which allows infiltration or storage of water at the point where the rain falls. But at present, there is no organisation, formal organisation in England, unlike Wales, that has a duty to adopt SUDs formally as part of that process. And that's something that we really need to progress urgently. We also need to address infiltration. Climate change is causing ground levels to rise, particularly in winter. And I know from some of the projects that I've personally worked on, just how challenging infiltration can be to drainage systems, particularly in rural areas. And the top left picture shows infiltration into the sewage system. Of course, it can come into the main sewers as well, but one of the primary sources is on private drainage. This is the principal cause of infiltration into many systems. And as an illustration, the treatment works in the bottom right from the Pennine regions. Modern treatment works for a medium-sized town. It has a treatment process, it has storm tanks in there. Those storm tanks remained full because of infiltration from private drainage, largely from private drainage, for the whole of the winter season. We could have doubled the capacity there of those storage tanks, and it would have made no difference, no appreciable difference to the volume of sewage discharged into the rivers. But water companies have no powers to work on private drainage. Only local authorities have powers to work on private drainage, but they have no duties to do that. And so there's not necessarily an incentive for them to address this problem. We also get misconnections. We can get misconnections actually on properties themselves. And I'll show this, this terrace house in the north of England here, which is quite interesting. And if I'm not going to give any prizes for spotting the misconnections, but I'll just tell you here that we have rainwater on this property, which is drained into the foul drainage, and waste from sinks, in other words, foul drainage, connected into the surface water pipe work. And that is not uncommon on private property. It's one of the principal causes of pollution from surface water outfalls on so-called separate systems. But this one on the right is quite interesting. This involves parallel foul and surface water sewers on a supposedly separate area in London, property built between the wars. This is some dye testing we did, where we put dye in one sewer and observed it in another sewer. And you can see from the two green dye in this picture that there is a cross flow, quite a considerable cross flow between the foul and surface water sewers. So this can result in an overloading of foul sewers, causing problems at treatment works and CSOs, but it can also cause a problem with separate surface water outfalls containing foul contaminants. And this is a principal cause of pollution in areas that are separately drained. So without that investigation, nothing appeared to be wrong with this drainage system. And the cause here was basically original construction, poor jointing, and both these pipes are laid in the same gravel-filled trench, so it's very easy for water to transfer from those leaking joints. And again, water companies have no power to deal with that. Doesn't mean they won't deal with it. It simply means that they have no automatic rights to deal with it. Maximising public sewer capacity, of course, is the remit of water companies, and I don't want to pretend from my earlier comments that we won't see substantial improvements. Helena's already talked about that this morning. And this is likely to involve building more storage tanks, new sewers, relining sewers, and of course upgrading treatment works. But that is a very expensive solution. Other projects which have been associated with this is managing flow above ground in Singapore. It's the naturalization of rivers to slow down the flows, create more capacity in the rivers themselves, and enable them to play a greater role in generally reducing pollution, because many of our urban drainage systems are affected by the lack of capacity in the natural watercourses into which they discharge. And this can provide additional benefits of biodiversity and recreation. Also managing flows above ground in extreme events. This is something we don't do very much. The photograph is here from the 2002 floods in Glasgow and shows the considerable volume of water which is typically transferred in flood events above ground. But there is a prospect to actively manage this. But this is a responsibility not of water companies or local authorities, but the highways authorities. And finally, building resilience to floods and pollution. In the top left picture, we have a standard detail of the entrance into Singapore's metro system, which is naturally raised above ground to stop the metro system flooding in times of heavy rainfall. In the right-hand side from the UK, a sacrificial car park area, where the buildings are built on stilts, and the low risk areas are used for car parking, though it would have been a good idea in this picture, I think, actually to move the cars before the flood event. Improving the assimilative capacity of watercourses, just making sure that we can get the maximum flow down our rivers. The more the flow, the better the assimilative capacity. And then finally, improving the flood resilience of buildings through retrofitting property flood resilience. And many of these features, the responsibility lies with property owners or with other organisations. So how do we actually get there? Just give me a couple of minutes to finish on this point. What is our plan going forward? It's not immediately obvious how we might get there. It's certainly complex, but the way we actually have organised this in the UK, probably by default rather than design, makes it complicated. Certainly, we must engage all stakeholders in this. It's not just a drainage or pollution or even rivers problem. We have to have all the players involved in designing our urban communities working on this collectively. It's very much a challenge of urban design. But of course, we have to get the public on board. And this is why openness and data that's been mentioned, I think, in all of the presentations this morning is so important. And as we can see from this slide, the public aren't necessarily naturally on board. And we have a lot of work to do in order to get them on board. So openness and data, very important part of that. And that is why we have to approach this problem with a multi-stakeholder approach, and why the research in the CAMELLIA programme, in my view, is so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was extremely interesting and very comprehensive. I think it shows that this is, as you say, a multi-stakeholder problem, that it's not just water companies, that there are a wide range of actors causing problems in terms of urban pollution. And in my view, interestingly, in Wales and in Scotland, there is a national water strategy. In England, we still don't have a national water strategy, a framework for this. And as you say, there is no responsibility for SUDS. I mean, when I worked previously in the water sector, it's very, very difficult to know the ownership and the long-term fate if you build SUDS, whereas Welsh Water are now progressing ahead with very, very large SUDS programs because there is a framework from Welsh Government. So you're absolutely right. We need to bring together all of these key players. We need to have an integrated approach. And yes, hopefully this is the sort of stuff that CAMELLIA is doing, bringing together the science and communities and different stakeholders to try and solve this problem. It's very easy just to say, look what the water companies are doing. It's much more complicated when actually it's all of our responsibilities. And several questions have already come in about misconnections and why. I can't understand why when you sell your house or you get a mortgage, when a survey's done, why there aren't checks for sewerage misconnections. It wouldn't be too difficult to do, but as you say, no one really has responsibility for it. So yes, a lot to think about there. Thank you, David. So we're now moving on to panel discussion and questions. If you've got any more questions, please post them in the Q&A, and we'll start with the first voted question, which I think I'll put to all of the panelists actually. How is the polluter pays principle implemented in the UK water system? Property owners, developers, road surface operators, are they required to manage water pollution from their surfaces before they hand the water over to the water companies and release it into the environment? If so, is the system for implementing it maintained? And are there mitigation measures, and are they working well? It's a very, very good question and very pertinent to what David has just said. David, do you want to address that one first? I mean, I think we know the answer, but interesting to hear.
It's actually it's an extremely good question, and quite a difficult one to answer. But I will try and answer it briefly. Firstly, in terms of new developments, of course, developers pay money to improve infrastructure in general, and specifically for their water services, pay a water service charge, which helps to improve the system. But one of the key anomalies with the regulations in the UK at the moment is that any property owner has a right to connect to a drainage system. So you can connect foul drainage into any system, whether it's overloaded. You can connect surface water into any system, whether it's overloaded. There's a small caveat to that, but that's the general principle. And one of the arguments that has been made is that if we're to have a better water strategy, as you mentioned, then that right of connect needs to be taken away, and some conditions put on it. For example, the water companies don't have the powers to insist that there is suds provided on new development, and they have no effective means really of retrofitting it to existing development. And secondly, there is an agreement that highway authorities can drain into water companies' drainage systems. There's no limit to that, so they can discharge any volumes or any pollutants into that. And although, to be fair, there are informal arrangements and cooperation between the different organisations, that's still an imperative that is there. And one has to ask the question that, you know, if we want to place the polluter pays principle in place, how sensible is the current right to connect and the current arrangements for highway drainage?
Thank you. Yes, Helena, I think it would be interesting to have a water company view on this. How much contact do you have with developers, highways authorities, that sort of thing?
Yeah, of course. So I was just going to say as well, Jacob, before, kind of touching on the development point, when we're looking at kind of water management in the UK, I think it's sort of going back to looking at the source apportionment model. So really kind of, you know, where almost looking at particular parameters and trying to figure out where that they're coming from. So I think a big part of it does depend on the data that we do have to kind of influence that conversation. So once you've almost got where each kind of the source of each of these problems are coming from, that's really the basis for building the kind of this integrated river basin management plan. But quite my understanding, the majority of that is directed at water companies to cover off the, I don't know, 20% problem in one river to maybe 80% in a different river for a different parameter. And I don't think that is a legally binding, but, you know, we need to deliver that as part of our business plans. And I'm not sure that the same kind of weight is put onto other sectors to kind of play their part in delivering addressing their pollutants. So I think there's a little bit there about the system, but kind of more so looking at development. You know, David's absolutely right. You know, the developers have a right to connect to our sewers, and we have to deal with that almost as an after thought. But we do work very closely with them to kind of have those conversations over, you know, particularly problem areas. I think that's becoming more pertinent now with some of the more sensitive rivers, chalk streams and things like that. But yeah, it is part of the kind of a bit of a meta problem. We don't have those rights over developers, so it makes it a little bit more problematic.
That's a very useful answer. And this is, as Adrian said at the start, this is a wicked problem, which is why the work you're doing and the work that CAMELLIA are doing, where they're trying to bring together stakeholders and apply science at the urban catchment level, is really quite useful. David, do you have any comments on this from a Rivers Trust's viewpoint? You must see these various sources of pollution all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the concept that Helena was talking about, the sort of fair share principle, does fall down if it's only focused on one sector. So I do see that as part of the issue. And what I've seen recently that is actually has the potential to really drive change is the concept of nutrient neutrality and water neutrality, which are being applied in different catchments. And what you see there is developers suddenly getting very interested in their responsibilities because they can't build any more houses until they start addressing it. I was at the Flood and Drainage X last week, and the companies that were selling SUDS type interventions have had their phone ringing off the hook from developers all of a sudden. I said, have they been talking to you all these years? And they said, no, they've not been interested at all, but they're really interested now. And so I think it is a really useful concept, and one that might drive a bit more change than the fair share one, which we seem to have got into a bit of a pickle with at the moment.
That's extremely interesting, because as a water company, we are being approached by lots of developers in the Horsham and Chichester area, asking us if we can look at rainwater harvesting or water efficiency measures to offset their water use for new developments, because of English Nature's new directive on water neutrality. And I think there's a couple of questions actually about how do we join up. Let me just go on to this question actually. There's a question saying, shouldn't wastewater treatment and water supply be considered together more systematically in the context of catchments between different sources and abstractions? And I think this water neutrality stuff will drive more rainwater harvesting, which will reduce the amount of water going into the sewers. So all of this needs to be viewed in an integrated way, in the way that the Rivers Trusts and everyone here has been talking about. But there are some positive moves on this. Philip, can you talk about how you think the new water bill is going to bring in these other stakeholders and address the problem, not just from a water company perspective, but also from a planning development side?
Well, I think the Environment Act is going to do relatively little on the planning side. There is a planning bill which the new Secretary of State, Michael Gove, has sort of put back for review. And one of the things that I'm talking to him about is trying to ensure that some of the issues that have been raised by other panels, the right to connect, the Schedule 3, which has been implemented in Wales but not in England, that should get more focus in the planning bill, which will be published at some stage, I think, it'll be first quarter next year. And that I think is where many of these issues beyond the water companies that David referring to, particularly in his presentation, need to be addressed. We need to be managing the flow of water so that we don't overload our treatment plants by pouring too much surface water into our water systems. And I think it was actually the Secretary of State who appeared before my select committee about 18 months ago, who acknowledged that we will not solve the problem of water quality until we have ultimately separated the surface and foul water drainage systems, and that is a mammoth undertaking because there's over 200,000 kilometres of it buried under our streets of combined drainage systems. And I think that's where some of these very significant numbers are being bandied about how much is it going to cost to stop sewage being spilt into the rivers. And we've got to come up with much more intelligent ways of dealing with this. And again, some of the presentations that we've had this morning show imaginative ways, without having to completely separate the systems, to start reducing the inflow at the entrance point systems. And I think developers have got a big role to play. I don't think at the moment that the charge which water companies levy to developers to connect to their drainage systems, it provides enough resource to enable systems to be separated. So we've got this, modest SUDS legislation which requires separation within a development, but as soon as it leaves the development, it no longer applies. And you therefore have the right to connect to the nearest passing train, and we've got to change that. And I think the planning bill is the place to do that.
Thank you. I think there's another question that sort of follows on from this. How do we do more to reduce rainwater entering combined sewers? Rainwater is a valuable resource, and reducing the flow in combined sewers will reduce the number of overflow incidents. I think there's also an issue that rainwater harvesting addresses water shortage problems. And if we look at other countries like Germany or Japan or Israel, there are legislative frameworks for rainwater harvesting. We're seeing some rainwater harvesting in the UK, but again, there aren't any legislative frameworks for rainwater harvesting or grey water reuse. I'll come to you first again, Philip. Is there any appetite for legislation in this area?
So I think we have to separate two things here. One is standards for new house building, where the Future Home Standard has been delayed, partly due to the pandemic, partly for other reasons, but is not now due to come into force until 2025, I think. And that should absolutely contain measures to cover grey water harvesting or better water management within the new build. But that's only going to affect future homes being built. And while the government has a target of building 300,000 a year, it's not going to address the problem that exists with the 29 million homes and all the commercial buildings and infrastructure that we have around the country, which is really creating the problem. So it's very difficult to retrofit grey water systems in a cost-effective way, as we're seeing with insulation, which is obviously more in the news at the moment than is water management. So I think it's difficult to see that applying at the household level. So it needs to be addressed by local authorities, highways authorities, where some of the surface water systems are commingled. I think we've got to remove that, and the challenge for doing that retrospectively is what is included in the bill, that there needs to be a report to Parliament by September next year of generating a proper estimate. What would it cost to put these systems into a position where they are not leading to sewage spilling into the rivers? And that's a sort of desktop exercise, and flowing from that, I think will be some decisions about what should be done about it. And I think events like this are really helpful in encouraging people to think about some of the things that can be done. We've heard the urban wetlands work. The reason I got interested in this subject in the first place was because we don't in the UK have a system of integrated construction wetlands, which they've been promoting in the EU, many EU countries for some time as part of the wastewater directive. We just haven't done it or implemented it here. We tended to rely much more on the sort of mechanical and chemical solutions. And with the whole focus of diversity improvement, natural capital and nature coming back into the thinking of how we decarbonise the economy, there's a real place for this. And I think this, the debate really only just getting underway as to how we should go about solving these linked problems.
Good. Well, I'm glad that the debate is taking place. It's on the new build. One of the other questions that has come in, well, one of the comments is quite alarming, is that people are seeing misconnections in new builds, which is extremely alarming, that we're even building new buildings where they're being wrongly connected to the sewers. So there needs to be action with developers. And I think what we need to see is, and hopefully the Natural England stuff around water neutrality will start to focus developers' minds on water a little bit more. But there is a major problem with our housing stock. David Balmforth, do you want to talk about the role of rainwater harvesting for reducing runoff? And also there was another question about, when we're developing land, are we intercepting springs and natural water courses and just diverting them into sewers? And should developers be looking at ensuring that those springs and natural water courses are left natural and are not diverted?
Well, I'll come to the second point first. We really should not be doing that, actually. I'm not so sure that is quite so widespread in relation to current new developments as you might be implying there. But certainly historically, one of the problems we face with our drainage systems today is that we have incorporated natural rivers, probably originally in pretty good condition, into our sewerage systems and mixed them all up with the foul waste, built over them, integrated them into our urban area, and it's extremely difficult now to daylight those rivers and make the space. And perhaps the most dramatic example of that is London itself, which has built over hundreds of water courses and rivers, if not thousands, and very difficult to unpick that now, given the current land values. Your first question about the role of rainwater harvesting and source control is hugely important in my view. Even simple things like retrofitting what we would call water butts in the UK, rainwater tanks. This can play a very significant role. You know, if we retain the first 10 millimetres of rainfall that falls on our urban areas, we would make a substantial contribution to reducing flood risk and pollution. We have a project in CAMELLIA to look specifically at that, which we're hoping to get some support for some practical implementation. We want to test how amenable private householders would be, whether they own their homes or they rent them, to installing water butts. We're looking at smart water butts, which can empty themselves slowly prior to storms, so they not only can provide a water resource, they can actually reduce storm flows in our sewage systems as well. I think there's great potential there. It's very exciting. Hope we manage to get a pilot project off the ground soon.
Severn Trent have done some interesting work on that in their Birmingham demonstrator as well, with smart water butts, which again shows very, very positive outcomes. So you're absolutely right. If you can take the peak off the hydrograph through installing water butts in people's gardens, the reduction in flooding could be quite impactful. Helena, do you want to talk around this subject of rainwater harvesting and also new developments?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's almost quite alarming, really, you know, that a misconnected patio of about 6 square meters can kind of discharge into the sewer at the same rate as about 100, the wastewater of 100 homes, which is quite a kind of, it's quite overwhelming when you think about it. So I think from you know, there's a couple of things that we can do collectively. I think sustainable drainage systems, so SUDs, is, you know, whether we're retrofitting those and making best use of kind of green spaces perhaps in urban areas, and really linking in with the local authorities there, so kind of having multi-use spaces as a kind of something which we could start to explore. I mean, from a perspective of kind of rainwater harvesting, you know, I think from a water usage point of view, we'll need everybody to be metered in order to really kind of see that sort of benefit there, and that's not, we're not quite at that stage yet, but we're kind of working towards that. So I think is kind of understanding your starting point fully is probably going to be a really useful point to kind of address first. But yeah, I definitely see lots of opportunities there, particularly around infiltration, but not from a point of view of new development. So I think from the perspective of dealing with an old sewer system in kind of where the groundwater levels are particularly high, we can see that being problematic in some areas as well to address. So I think, again, quite multifaceted in terms of the sources of these problems, but definitely lots of opportunities to kind of retrofit and address them.
It sort of links into one of the other questions actually that has come up, so which is how do we drive sustainable urban designing and planning, as opposed to just mitigating the impact of unsustainable development. So can we actually build new developments that have a positive impact on urban water quality? Can you see that as a view? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it'll be difficult, but I do think it is possible. I think it comes back to that point around having everybody around the table. So both kind of the carrot and the stick, really. So you need that kind of legislation change to support that. But I think if you've got the right players around the table, kind of having those discussions and create kind of opportunities that are beneficial for each of those parties, I think you'll really start to see people moving in the same direction.
I mean, I think some of the things that David was talking about in Singapore, you are seeing, when new development comes in, you're seeing people uncovering culverted urban streams, which again has reduces urban heat islands, all that sort of stuff. So there are opportunities, in my view, for developments to actually be positive. David Johnson, is this something that the Rivers Trust have been looking at?
I mean, yeah, for me, it's the twin track approach of regulation and partnership that is so important. You know, the regulator, and that's exactly what Helena was just saying there. It's the carrot and the stick. And the regulator's got to have teeth and focus on regulation. And at the same time, that regulator is not great at building partnerships. You know, if you're going to wield a stick, you're not great at building partnerships. And so there needs to be, in my opinion, a little bit of a glass wall between the two sides. And then on the other side, the collaborative stuff, all the stuff that we've been talking about today, that needs to be kind of embedded in government thinking and supported, so that kind of co-design with communities can really work. So that whole sort of idea of the nutrient neutrality and the water neutrality, that's the stick. That's kind of forcing people to then come and talk to their local catchment partnership, and the developer who hasn't been talking for a long time is then forced to talk to us about building some wetlands, for example. And that's exactly what's happening in the west of England at the moment. And I think it's that twin track thing, you know, use the stick to force people to collaborate. And if they don't collaborate, then I'm afraid they have to be regulated. So that's our kind of feeling on this.
That's very positive.
Can I pick up one quick point on this, Jacob? And that's that there is a regulation coming into effect for new developments to have 10% biodiversity net gain. Now, one of the ways that will be achieved will be introducing wetland areas within developments to take runoff of surface water. So I think there's a real opportunity there to address some of these things through that specific legislation which is coming.
That's very positive. Okay, slightly different question now. And I think probably you answered this bit already, Philip. General question to panelists: is the UK water regulatory environment still comparative to the EU Water Framework Directive following Brexit? And I think, Philip, you've already said that it is Water Framework Directive Plus. So if the panelists could just give me a quick answer to this one, do you think we have better or worse regulation for water than before and after Brexit? Philip?
Well, yes, I mean, I think we've introduced measures in the Environment Act which go beyond what we would have had to do under the EU Water Directive. Having said that, there is also no doubt that the performance of our sort of natural world in relation to water, isn't as good as applies in many countries in Europe. We've got one water body which has got bathing water quality status, which is the River Wharfe in Ilkley. I think in Germany it's close to 600, in France it's over 400. So we're way behind in the way that we've implemented EU water directives, at least in terms of regulatory goodness. We've identified lots of areas where we've got work to do, but I think from a regulatory point of view, we're currently sitting a bit ahead of Europe, but we haven't perhaps implemented in the way that we should have done.
Great. Okay. No, that's a very good answer. David Balmforth, do you?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to answer this slightly differently. There's absolutely no point in having regulations if we don't know how well they're being implemented. And so there's two aspects of that. One is having some evidence base, and this is why David Johnson's point earlier about and I was particularly taken by it, about measuring how well some of your measures actually work by collecting data and showing those, demonstrating those improvements. But it's also important from the enforcement point of view. And I am concerned that as we take measures forward and we introduce regulations, whether the regulatory authorities, whether they're the financial and business regulator in Ofwat or the environmental regulator in the Environment Agency, actually has the necessary powers, duties and resources, and particularly that last point, for ensuring that we do actually meet those regulations. So enforcement is a key element. It can be done with a light touch, but it does need resources to be effective.
No, it's a very, very good point. Helena, better or worse?
I think I just would concur with the 2 points before. I think it's we've implemented the WFD as is, and written that kind of into our own legislation. But I do think we've got the opportunity now to go beyond that, and it's really welcoming to see that the new bills coming through do recognise the broader problems that we've got and trying to address those. But as David quite rightly said, the evidence really is going to be the proof will be in the pudding in terms of what we actually are kind of seeing and with benefits. So real kind of homing in on implementing and having tougher kind of enforcement of those regulations, I think will certainly help and contribute to improving rivers.
Thank you. And David, better or worse?
Better.
Thank you.
Because I'm an optimist. I think we've got the opportunity to be much better. Time will tell whether we take that opportunity, but you can see the public is right behind this. That they want us to get better. They want us to be better, and I think we've got the opportunity to do that.
That's a very, very positive note. Okay, one question more, and then I'm going to sum up. There's a question here around education. So CAMELLIA is working with Year 9 students and teachers on water availability under climate change. Should that be expanded to include urban water pollution as well? If we have more about water in mainstream education, would this increase public understanding and public support for water infrastructure? You first, David. Quickly, please.
Like me, I've done some work in schools on exactly this, slightly younger groups, but it's enormously entertaining, extremely valuable for their education. The more we can get in early with children to understand some of the challenges we face in society, the better.
Great. And Helena, I know that Thames does a lot of outreach on this already, but what's your view on it actually being part of the curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, definitely giving as many opportunities as possible to young people to kind of, understand those challenges from a very early age. I think it needs to be kind of taken into context of all of the different types of challenges that we do face in terms of kind of where there perhaps needs to be some real innovation, and where you know, the challenges, the solutions haven't quite been figured out yet, and those are the real opportunity areas for kind of bringing in younger people with fresher ideas into that.
Great. David Johnson, I mean, this is the stuff you do anyway, so.
It is the stuff we do, and I've always been really passionate about it, but something recently has really challenged my thinking a bit more, which is this concept of nature connectedness, and the fact that nature connectedness explains sort of 70% of environmental behaviours and education 2%. So I think our role has got to be, you know, we've sort of thought, actually our role is just connecting people. Including children, connect them with what's going on, help them understand, you know, eels in classroom, all this kind of thing. That's what I think our contribution to it can be. So that's where we're going to focus.
And Philip, again, I know the parliamentarians are constantly doing. What's your view on it?
Well, as it happens, yesterday I added my name in support of a private member's bill from a member of my committee, Nadia Whitome, who's a Labour MP, and I found myself as one of 10 people alongside such luminaries as Jeremy Corbyn and the chairman of 2 other Conservative chairs of select committees, supporting a climate and ecology education bill. Now, I don't think it'll go anywhere, but it was absolutely following up a recommendation of the Green Job part of the Green Jobs report for an inquiry that we had done, saying that we need to embed climate education and sustainability education in national curriculum. So I think it's really important that we do more on this than we are at the moment, and I think we need to start at primary schools.
I think it's extremely positive to see the cross-party working on this as well. This cuts across party politics. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. There are lots and lots of other questions, but unfortunately we don't have time for those. Worth also looking in the chat, where there's an interesting post from Joanne Williams about Historic England project they're doing. Please get in touch with her. So I've got to sum up. I think I have -2 minutes. So very, very quickly, as Adrian said, it is a wicked problem. It's highly complex. Yes, there is an urban water crisis, but clearly from our speakers, our questions and our audience, there is a lot of work that's taking place to address this. And the key thing that's come out of this is we need better data. We need more transparency. We need more understanding that there are lots and lots of players involved in this, that there isn't just a single source of urban water pollution. And also that we need innovation and collaboration. There needs to be a lot more cross-sector working. There need to be a lot more people working on this problem together, adopting this. We need to engage the public. We need to have the public on side. It doesn't need to be about blame. It needs to be about working together to find solutions in an open, inclusive way with co-design. And that's the sort of thing that CAMELLIA is doing. So I would commend you to have a look at the projects they're doing and also the tools that they're developing, which will enable this. Thank you very much to our amazing speakers and to the discussion and to the questions. That I found that extremely interesting and informative. Thank you. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for your great chairing of this session. And again, I'd like to just add my thanks to the speakers, to David Johnson from the Rivers Trust, Right Honourable Philip Dunne MP, and Helena Soteriou from Thames Water, and of course David Balmforth. It's been a very, very stimulating discussion. I think there's been some really interesting themes coming out about, as Jacob summed up, data, and the need for data transparency to provide the evidence that we need, but also how we better facilitate multi-stakeholder engagement, and how do we visualize and better use models to look at, because this is an integrated problem. And so I hope you will, after a short break, come back and join us. Please use the additional link. We'll go to a Zoom meeting. There'll be breakout rooms, and you have an opportunity to see some of the tools that are exactly addressing these issues. And you'll be able to talk to the developers and have some interaction with them and see hopefully that this is something which will be of interest to you. So I'd like to just say on behalf of everyone, thank you, and particularly for those of you who joined. I hope you found this a really interesting morning, and I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes. So thank you very much.